The first time my daughter-in-law said my name after my son died, it wasn't spoken aloud. It was typed, cold and final, in a message that told me I was not welcome at his funeral. I remember sitting at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, like it was counting something I didn't want to face. I had been staring at my hands, still swollen from crying, still smelling faintly of the soup I'd reheated and forgotten to eat. When I picked up the phone, I expected details, time, place, something human. Instead, the message read, "The service will be private. Please respect our wishes." No, "I'm sorry." No, "I know this is hard." Just that. For a long moment, I didn't understand what I was reading. I reread it 3 times, like maybe the words would soften if I gave them time. They didn't. My chest tightened, and I felt the strange, hollow panic of a mother realizing she had just been erased from her own child's goodbye. I typed back with shaking thumbs. "I'm his mother. I just want to say goodbye." The dots appeared, disappeared, then nothing. That was how I learned that grief, when mixed with power, can turn cruel very fast. Before all of this, before funerals and legal papers and doors closing in my face, my life was quiet in a way I had earned. I lived alone in the same small house I raised my son in, a narrow 2-story place with creaky stairs and a porch that sagged slightly on the left. The paint needed work, the mailbox leaned, but it was home. It smelled like lemon cleaner and old books, and if you opened the hall closet too fast, you could still catch the faint scent of my late husband's aftershave trapped in the coats, like a memory that refused to leave. My son, Daniel, grew up here. I still called him Danny, though he pretended to hate it. He was the kind of boy who always took the long way home because he liked to think. Quiet, observant. He'd sit at the kitchen counter while I cooked, asking questions about nothing in particular, tapping his fingers against the wood in little rhythms only he understood. When he married Laura, I told myself I was lucky. She was polite, soft-spoken. She smiled with her lips, not her eyes, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Not everyone shows warmth the same way, I reasoned. At their wedding, she hugged me lightly, like you hug a coworker you don't want to offend. Daniel squeezed my hand afterward and whispered, "She's just shy, Mom." So I believed him. They moved into an apartment across town, and I gave them space. I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law people complain about. I waited for invitations instead of inviting myself. I brought food when asked. I stayed quiet when Laura corrected me, gently but often, about things that didn't really matter. How Daniel liked his coffee now, what he preferred to be called, which holidays they were keeping small. Still, Daniel called me every Sunday. Sometimes the conversations were short, sometimes longer. Sometimes Laura was in the background, sometimes not. But I always heard my son's voice, steady and familiar, and that was enough. Until the call that never came. The night Daniel died, the police knocked on my door just after midnight. I remember noticing how young one of them looked, his face too smooth for the words he was about to say. I remember grouping the door frame because the world tilted and I was afraid I might slide right out of it. They said it was sudden, an accident. One moment he was here, and then he wasn't. That's how they always say it, as if phrasing can soften the blow. Laura called me the next morning. Her voice was controlled, almost businesslike. She said she'd take care of everything and that she'd let me know about arrangements. I told her I could come help, stay with her, cook, clean, do anything. There was a pause, just a second too long. She said, "I need space. This is a lot." I understood that, or I thought I did. Days passed, then a week. I heard about my son's death through hushed phone calls and distant relatives before I heard another word from his wife. When I finally reached out again, that's when the message came, the one that told me I was not welcome. The funeral happened on a Tuesday. I know because I sat in my living room all day, dressed in black, listening to the rain tap against the windows. I imagined the room where they'd laid him. I imagined the sound of his name being spoken. I imagined a moment when someone might mention me, if only in passing. No one did. After that, the silence grew heavier. Laura stopped responding altogether. My calls went unanswered. My messages stayed unread. It was as if my son's death had not only taken him from me, but had given her permission to cut me out completely. I told myself it was grief, that people do strange things when they're hurting. I tried to be patient. I tried to be kind even in my own thoughts. Then, 3 weeks after the funeral I wasn't allowed to attend, there was a knock on my door. It was a sharp knock, official, the kind that doesn't ask, it announces. When I opened it, Laura stood there in a neat gray coat, her hair pulled back, her face composed. Beside her was a man in a suit, holding a folder. She said, "I need to talk to you," not meeting my eyes. That's when I knew, before a single document was opened, that this wasn't about grief anymore. This was about something else entirely. I didn't invite them in right away. I stood there, one hand on the door, the other gripping the edge of the frame like it might anchor me to something solid. Laura's eyes flicked briefly past me into the hallway as if she were already measuring the space. The man beside her cleared his throat once, politely, professionally. "May we come in?" he asked. His voice was calm, practiced, the kind of voice that had delivered bad news before and would do it again without losing sleep. I stepped aside. They walked into my living room like guests who already knew where everything was. Laura didn't look at the photos on the wall. Daniel at 5 with a missing front tooth, Daniel at 17 holding his first toolbox, Daniel on his wedding day, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. She kept her gaze forward, fixed on the couch where she sat without being asked. The man remained standing. He opened the folder. "I'll get us some tea," I said automatically, because that's what I did when my hands didn't know where else to go. "No need," she said quickly, too quickly. "This won't take long." That should have been my first real warning. I sat across from her, my knees touching the coffee table Daniel had built with his own hands during a summer home from college. He'd sanded it for days, refusing help, proud in that quiet way of his. Laura rested her purse on it now, leaving a faint scratch in the wood. The man finally spoke. "My name is Mr. Collins. I represent Mrs. Harris in matters related to her late husband's estate." Late husband. The words landed heavily, like stones placed carefully on my chest. "There seems to be some confusion," he continued, flipping a page, "regarding property ownership." Laura folded her hands in her lap. Her nails were freshly done, pale pink. I noticed because I always noticed small things when I was nervous. "What property?" I asked. "The house," Laura said finally, lifting her eyes to meet mine. "This house." I laughed once. I couldn't help it. It came out wrong, thin and sharp. "This is my house." "It was," she corrected, "but Daniel intended for it to become ours." There it was, the shift, the subtle rewriting of reality. Mr. Collins slid a document toward me. "Your son discussed plans to transfer ownership prior to his passing. Mrs. Harris believes this reflects his wishes." I didn't touch the paper. I stared at Laura instead. Daniel never said anything to me about that. "He wouldn't," she said quietly. "You didn't exactly make it easy for him." That hurt more than I expected. I felt it settle somewhere deep, like an old bruise being pressed without warning. "What does that mean?" I asked. She sighed as if tired, as if this were all an inconvenience. He felt guilty, always tied to this place, to you. He wanted to start fresh. My hands trembled. I called him every Sunday. Yes, she said, out of obligation. I shook my head slowly. You didn't even let me go to his funeral. Her jaw tightened. That was my decision. No, I said, finding my voice. That was control. Mr. Collins cleared his throat again. We're not here to debate emotional matters. We're here to discuss legal ones. That was when I finally looked at the paper. It was a petition, formal, clean, full of language that felt sharp around the edges, words like intent and beneficiary and transfer. I pushed it back toward him. Daniel never signed anything like this. Laura leaned forward then, her voice dropping. You don't know everything my husband told me. That sentence sat between us like a challenge. They left soon after. Laura paused at the door, her hand on the knob. I suggest you cooperate. It's what Daniel would have wanted. When the door closed, the house felt different, smaller, as if it had overheard something it shouldn't have. I sat there for a long time after they were gone, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock. I touched the arm of the couch where Daniel used to sit, his leg always bouncing slightly, like he was impatient with stillness. That night I didn't sleep. I walked from room to room, touching things, the chipped tile in the bathroom he'd helped me replace, the dent in the hallway wall from when he'd tried to move a dresser by himself at 14, the faint pencil marks on the doorframe where I'd measured his height year after year. This house wasn't just walls and wood. It was a record of a life, of my life with my son. And suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. Laura wasn't grieving anymore. She was collecting. The next morning I called my friend Ruth. We'd worked together for years before retirement, and she had always been the kind of woman who listened without interrupting. She wants the house, I said, my voice cracking. She says Daniel meant it for her to have it. There was a pause. Then Ruth said carefully, Did he ever mention that to you? Never. Then you shouldn't assume she's telling the truth. That was the first time someone gave voice to the thought I'd been too afraid to say aloud. Later that week, I found myself standing in Daniel's old bedroom, the one I'd kept mostly untouched. I opened the closet, ran my fingers along the sleeves of his jacket still hanging there. In the back, tucked into a shoebox, I found something unexpected, a folder. Inside were old bank statements, correspondence, and a handwritten note folded neatly. It wasn't addressed to me, but it was in Daniel's handwriting, and the first line made my heart stop. If anything ever happens to me, I need someone to know the truth. I sat on the edge of Daniel's bed with the folder open on my lap, the mattress dipping beneath my weight the same way it always had. The room smelled faintly of dust and cedar, the way rooms do when they've been closed off too long. I held the note like it might dissolve if I gripped it too tightly. If anything ever happens to me, I need someone to know the truth. My eyes traced the familiar slant of his handwriting, every loop and line unmistakably his. Daniel had always written slowly, carefully, as if he wanted each word to earn its place. I unfolded the rest of the page. He wrote about pressure, about feeling trapped between expectations, about conversations that turned into arguments the moment he questioned them. He didn't name Laura directly at first, but her presence lingered in every sentence, like a shadow just out of frame. She says it's for our future, he wrote, but sometimes it feels like I'm signing parts of myself away. I swallowed hard. Beneath the note were documents, bank statements showing withdrawals I didn't recognize, made in neat, steady amounts, not reckless, planned. There were emails printed out too, messages between Daniel and someone listed as a financial advisor, though the language felt off, too vague, too insistent. I read until my eyes burned. Suddenly, the conversation in my living room replayed itself in a new light. Laura's certainty, her ease, the way she'd spoken about Daniel's intentions as if they were facts she owned. I closed the folder and sat there in the quiet, my thoughts racing. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I didn't know what to say yet. I didn't even know what I had. That night, I dreamed of Daniel standing at the end of the hallway, trying to speak while someone kept closing doors between us. The next morning, I made an appointment with a local attorney. His office was small and smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. He listened without interrupting as I explained about the funeral, the visit, the papers, the folder. He leaned back in his chair when I finished. "You still hold the deed to the house," he said. "Unless there's a signed transfer, she doesn't have a claim." "She said Daniel intended to give it to her," I replied. "Intent isn't ownership," he said gently, "and grief doesn't create legal rights." That should have reassured me, but something still felt unsettled. "She said I didn't make it easy for him," I added, "that he felt tied to me." The attorney folded his hands. "That sounds like emotional leverage." I left his office feeling steadier, but not calm, because if Laura truly believed Daniel wanted the house, why hadn't she brought proof? Why intimidation instead of transparency? Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't before, small things. A neighbor mentioned seeing Laura at the house shortly after Daniel died, going through the mail. Another asked if I'd resolved the situation with the estate yet, as if it were common knowledge. I checked my mailbox more carefully after that. One afternoon, I found an envelope addressed to Daniel that had been opened, then resealed sloppily. Inside was a notice from a credit company. My heart thudded as I read it. There were balances I didn't recognize, accounts opened recently. Daniel had never been careless with money. He paid things early, worried about interest, kept receipts like they were proof of responsibility. This didn't fit. I drove to the apartment he and Laura had shared. The building manager recognized me immediately. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Daniel was a good tenant." "Was?" I echoed. "They moved out," she said, "about a month before the accident." My breath caught. "Moved out where?" She hesitated. "I assumed you knew." I didn't. When I got home, there was a message waiting on my phone, Laura's voice this time, calm, controlled. "I've been advised to limit contact. Any further communication should go through my lawyer." That was when something inside me hardened. This wasn't just grief, this was strategy. I went back to the folder that night, combing through every document slowly, methodically. I noticed patterns, transfers that lined up with dates Daniel sounded unusually tired on the phone, emails where he asked questions and received evasive answers. One email stood out. It was addressed not to Laura, but from her. "You worry too much," she'd written. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." I stared at that line for a long time. Daniel had trusted people easily. He believed love meant shared direction. I worried about that when he married, but I told myself it wasn't my place. Now, standing in the quiet of the house he'd grown up in, I realized something painful. My son hadn't been planning to give his wife my home. He'd been trying to protect himself. The realization didn't come with relief. It came with grief layered on top of grief, a mother's sorrow for the son she lost and the son she hadn't fully seen while he was still here. The next step frightened me, because uncovering the truth meant pulling at threads that Laura had clearly woven tightly, and I knew instinctively that she wouldn't let them unravel without a fight. But for the first time since Daniel died, I wasn't frozen. I was moving. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became that Daniel's death had left behind more than grief. It had left a mess, one carefully hidden beneath polite words and legal language. I started by requesting copies of Daniel's bank records, something the attorney helped me with once I showed him the folder. We sat together at his desk as he spread the pages out, line by line, date by date. "These withdrawals," he said, tapping one column, "they're consistent, not random." "They started after he got married," I replied. He nodded once. "And they stop about 6 weeks before his death." That timing sat heavy in my chest. I drove home afterward in silence, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The world outside moved normally, people walking dogs, kids on bikes, a woman watering her lawn, but I felt separated from it, like I was watching through glass. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a car parked across the street that I didn't recognize. A woman sat inside, pretending to scroll on her phone. When our eyes met briefly, she looked away too fast. I told myself not to imagine things. Grief can make suspicion feel like certainty. But that night, when I checked my porch, I found faint scuff marks near the door. Someone had been there recently. I slept with the light on. A few days later, the attorney called me back in. His tone was more serious this time. "There's something you should see," he said. He slid a document across the desk. It was a loan agreement. Daniel's name was on it, but the signature looked wrong, close enough to pass at a glance, off enough to make my stomach drop. "That's not his handwriting," I whispered. "It could be challenged," he said carefully, "but more importantly, the beneficiary of this loan is not a bank." He pointed to the name, Laura. I felt my face go cold. According to the document, Daniel had taken out a sizable loan in the months before his death, supposedly to consolidate debt. The funds had gone directly into an account in Laura's name. "And the house?" I asked. The attorney sighed. "There's no legal transfer, but she's claiming verbal intent, supported by these financial moves." In other words, she was building a story, one where Daniel had been financially unstable, dependent, eager to secure his wife's future at any cost. I drove home afterward and sat in my car for a long time before going inside. I thought about every conversation I'd had with Laura, every gentle correction, every boundary she enforced, every time she spoke for Daniel instead of letting him speak. The betrayal wasn't just about money or property. It was about rewriting my son's life after he could no longer defend it. I confronted her the next morning. I didn't plan it. I just found myself dialing her number before fear could stop me. She answered on the third ring. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want the truth about the loan, about the accounts, about why you moved out without telling anyone." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "You're grasping," she said. "This won't change anything." "Did you pressure him? Did you make him sign things he didn't understand? You always thought you knew him better than I did, but you didn't live with him. You didn't see how weak he was at the end." That word, weak, hit me like a slap. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice shaking. "He was my son, and he was my husband, which means what he left behind is mine." I hung up before she could say anything else. That night, I cried the way I hadn't since the police left my doorstep. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears soaking into the pillow, carrying years of love and regret with them. But grief no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened me. With the attorney's help, we filed a formal response to Laura's claim. We requested a forensic review of the signatures. We subpoenaed records from the so-called financial advisor, who turned out not to be licensed at all. The cracks spread quickly after that. Neighbors came forward. The building manager confirmed Laura pushed for the move, citing privacy issues. A co-worker of Daniel's shared emails where he'd expressed confusion about money he didn't remember authorizing. And then, One afternoon, Laura showed up at my door again. This time, she was alone. "You're making this ugly," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't before. Fear, not grief. Fear. "It was always ugly," I replied quietly. "You just didn't expect me to look." She left without another word. 2 weeks later, her lawyer withdrew. That was the moment I knew the truth was finally catching up to her. Once Laura's lawyer withdrew, the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of someone scrambling behind closed doors. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was tired. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that came from holding grief and vigilance at the same time. Every morning I woke up expecting another letter, another threat, another demand dressed up as entitlement. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I gathered everything Daniel had left behind, not just documents, memories, old emails, voicemails I'd never deleted, a birthday card he'd sent me 3 years earlier with a note written crookedly in the corner because he'd run out of space. "Love you always, Mom. I don't say it enough." I brought these things to the attorney's office in careful stacks, my hands steady even when my heart wasn't. He reviewed them quietly, occasionally nodding. "This helps," he said. "It shows intent, but not the kind she's claiming." The legal process moved slowly after that, painfully slowly. There were hearings scheduled, postponed, rescheduled again. Each delay felt like being asked to relive the worst moments on repeat. Laura filed a counterclaim alleging emotional dependency, that I had manipulated Daniel into staying financially tied to me, that I'd burdened him with this house, this life. When I read the statement, I felt something inside me finally break free. I wasn't angry anymore. I was clear. At the first hearing, I sat quietly in the back row. Laura avoided my eyes. She looked smaller there, without control of the room, without her practiced calm. Her hands fidgeted, her foot tapped. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I told the truth. I spoke about raising my son alone after his father died, about teaching him how to fix a leaky faucet and how to apologize when he was wrong, about the house not as an asset, but as a place where a boy learned how to be a man. I spoke about boundaries, about stepping back when he married, about respecting his choices even when they scared me. And then I spoke about the folder, the note, the fear in his words. "I believe my son was trying to protect himself," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my chest, "and now I'm protecting what he couldn't." Laura's attorney tried to paint me as sentimental, emotional, out of touch, but facts don't bend easily. The forensic report confirmed the signatures had been altered. The financial advisor disappeared when contacted. The loan was deemed fraudulent. Each piece fell into place like a truth that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. Outside the courthouse one afternoon, Laura finally approached me. Her eyes were red, her composure cracked. "You didn't have to ruin me," she said. I studied her face. I thought of the night she banned me from my son's funeral, of the way she spoke his name like a possession. "I didn't ruin you. You did that yourself." She walked away without responding. The judge ruled a month later. The house remained mine. The loan was voided. Laura was ordered to repay funds and barred from making further claims against Daniel's estate. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gavel slam, no gasp from the room, just a quiet acknowledgement of truth. In the weeks that followed, the house felt different again, but this time lighter. I opened windows, let air move through rooms that had held too much silence. I repainted the living room, the color Daniel had once joked looked like old oatmeal. I fixed the porch step that had been sagging for years. Neighbors stopped by. Some apologized for assuming, others just sat with me, sharing coffee, letting me talk about Daniel without flinching. One afternoon, I received a letter from Laura. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't kind, but it was honest in its own way. She wrote that she'd been afraid of being left with nothing, that she'd believed entitlement was the same as security, that she hadn't expected resistance. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but closure, because holding on to it would mean carrying her story forward, and I didn't want to do that anymore. I visited Daniel's grave for the first time alone on a quiet morning. I brought flowers he liked, simple ones, nothing fancy. I sat on the grass and told him everything. I saw it too late, but I see it now. I said softly. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird called. For the first time since his death, I felt like I could breathe. News doesn't travel loudly in small communities. It seeps. It settles into conversations at grocery stores and the pauses between pleasantries and the way people stop lowering their voices when you walk by. I noticed it first at the pharmacy. The woman behind the counter, someone I'd known for years, met my eyes and gave a small, careful nod. Not pity, recognition. "I'm glad it worked out," she said quietly as she handed me my change. I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't need to. The story made its way through town in pieces, reshaped by retellings but anchored in the same truth. The widow who tried to take what wasn't hers, and the mother who stood her ground without shouting. Some people asked questions, others didn't. Most just listened. Laura, on the other hand, stopped coming around entirely. She moved out of the apartment complex across town and, from what I heard, took a job in another county. No one said it outright, but the implication lingered. Distance was easier than explanation. Daniel's co-workers reached out slowly, one by one. A man named Eric invited me for coffee. He spoke in halting sentences, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He was stressed, he said, about money, about decisions he felt pushed into. I nodded. He didn't like conflict. No, Eric agreed, but he didn't like feeling cornered either. At the next community meeting, someone suggested naming a small volunteer award after Daniel. He'd spent weekends helping elderly neighbors fix fences, install shelves, do small things without being asked. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a recognition, and somehow that felt right. I attended the ceremony quietly, sitting in the back. When his name was spoken, there was a ripple of applause. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, respectful. I didn't cry. I went home afterward and stood in the doorway of the house, listening to the echo of footsteps that weren't there anymore. The place no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a witness, one that had seen truth rise slowly, without spectacle. Laura's absence became its own consequence. Not exile, not punishment, just a quiet removal from the story she tried to rewrite. Months later, a distant relative mentioned that Laura had told her side to someone else, that she'd framed herself as misunderstood, as overwhelmed. I didn't correct it. Some lessons don't need defending. What mattered was that the truth had been spoken where it counted, in court, in records, in the lives Daniel had touched. One afternoon, I found myself sorting through old photo albums, the kind with plastic sleeves that stick slightly when you turn the page. There was a picture of Daniel at 12, holding a crooked birdhouse we'd built together. His smile was wide, unguarded. I realized then that justice doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like reclaiming memory. I began opening my home again, inviting friends over for tea, letting laughter return to rooms that had held too much silence. I planted a small garden in the backyard, something I'd always put off. The soil stained my hands, grounding me in the present. One evening, Ruth came by with a pie. She set it down on the counter and hugged me, long and tight. "You stood tall," she said. I stood still. There's a difference. We laughed softly. That night, I slept without leaving the light on. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, uneven and quiet, like light slipping through curtains in the early morning. Some days I felt strong enough to rearrange furniture, to donate Daniel's old clothes, to speak his name without my throat tightening. Other days, I stood in the doorway of his room and felt time fold in on itself, grief pressing close, like an old ache that never fully leaves. But something had shifted. The house was no longer under threat, and neither was my sense of self. I wasn't defending my right to exist in my son's story anymore. I was living in it, on my own terms. I took a part-time job at the local library, shelving books and helping people find what they were looking for. There was something comforting about the order of it, the quiet understanding that stories matter, even when they're worn or overlooked. Sometimes I caught myself recommending novels Daniel had loved, smiling to myself when someone nodded and took them home. On weekends, I volunteered at the community center, where they'd placed Daniel's name on a small plaque near the workshop. I watched young men struggle with the same tools he once mastered, and I offered help when asked, stepping back when they figured it out on their own. It felt like honoring him without holding on to pain. One afternoon, while sorting through a donation box, I found a set of old house keys. Daniel's handwriting was on the tag. Mom's place. I sat down hard in the nearest chair and held them until my palms hurt. That was when I finally understood something I'd been circling for months. Daniel hadn't been trying to escape this house. He'd been trying to protect it, and me, from becoming leverage. The thought didn't erase the past, but it softened it. It gave shape to a love that hadn't always known how to speak for itself. I wrote Laura a final letter I never sent. In it, I didn't accuse or explain. I simply said goodbye to the version of her I thought I knew, and to the version of my son she'd tried to control. Writing it felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. Grief, I learned, doesn't demand forgiveness, it asks for honesty. As spring turned into summer, the garden bloomed. Tomatoes ripened, basil spilled over its planter. Neighbors stopped to comment, to ask advice, to linger. Life continued, not because it forgot, but because it remembered how to move. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, I hosted a small gathering. Nothing formal, just coffee, cake, and stories. People spoke about him in fragments. His patience, his dry humor, the way he listened more than he talked. I listened too, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was holding myself together for their sake. I was simply there. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room and looked around. The walls held decades of memory, joy and sorrow layered like paint, none of it wasted. I whispered into the quiet, I did the best I could, and I believed it. I still live in the same house. Some people think that's strange. They ask if it isn't painful, walking through rooms where memories echo so loudly. They ask if it wouldn't be easier to sell, to start fresh somewhere no one knows my story. But this house was never the problem. It was never about walls or deeds or who signed what. It was about truth. This house holds the sound of my son's laughter, the scrape of his chair against the kitchen floor, the way he used to lean in the doorway and talk to me about his worries without quite naming them. It holds the version of him that existed before anyone tried to turn love into leverage. And it holds the version of me that survived losing him. What I learned through all of this is something no one tells you when grief first knocks the air out of your lungs. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most aren't strangers. They're the ones who believe your silence is permission. I was quiet for a long time. I thought dignity meant stepping back. I thought love meant not asking questions. But there's a difference between respect and erasure, and I had to learn that the hard way. Standing up for myself didn't bring my son back. Nothing could. But it did something else. It protected his story. And it reminded me that being a mother doesn't end when the world tells you to step aside. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel like your grief was inconvenient, if someone tried to take advantage of your pain, your kindness, your silence, please hear this. You are allowed to stand your ground without becoming bitter. Justice doesn't have to be loud to be real. So I'll ask you this, because I still think about it sometimes when the house is quiet at night. If you were in my place, if someone tried to rewrite your child's life after they were gone, would you have stayed silent, or would you have fought the way I did? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about truth, family, and finding strength when everything feels broken, please consider subscribing. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone.